wear the tagless one so that it doesn't matter which way it goes. The tag's always. Just kidding. All right, moving on.
Moving on. So, what I wanted to talk about today was something that recently, for whatever reason, came up. And I had a conversation with someone about what noise abatement procedures are. Now,
that's a good topic.
General aviation, noise abatement procedures could be relatively minor, like, fly a certain heading and avoid the golf course or avoid a housing development because of the noise that your aircraft makes. So you have to, the airport will have a charted noise abatement procedure. Usually, what is that, on the back of the 10.9 or somewhere around there, they usually have an ODP.
Obstacle departure.
Yep. So usually a noise abatement procedure is defined there or maybe in an extra page. However, when you're flying jet aircraft or airlines or corporate jets, there's usually a procedure for you that may not be charted, and you'll just see something like a sign on the taxi out that says all jet aircraft must follow NADP1 procedures. And you look at each other and go, what's that? And this happened to us about a year and a half ago. At that particular trip, I remember I was flying with actually one of our previous featured guests. And it was actually Captain Ash, who I was flying with. And I think we were in Austin, if my memory serves me correctly. And taxiing out in Austin from the terminal to, I believe it was 36 left, and taxiing on taxiway Charlie, and we were going through our flow procedures, and there's a point where the first officer has his head and eyes in the cockpit because the captain's doing the flight control check. And the captain, his eyes are outside because it's usually during a taxi period, especially in VFR. There's no reason to stop the airplane to do this. It was a long taxi, so he's taxiing the airplane and he's manipulating the flight controls, and I have my responses, full up, full down, full left, full right. And so my eyes are really in the cockpit, but something caught my eye. Something in my peripheral caught my eye. It was a big yellow sign. It was right there on the right side of the taxiway, and it said all jet aircraft must follow NADP 1 procedures. And I go, huh. And of course, that raised the little red flag in my captain's ear. And he goes, wait, what? And I'm like, well, let's finish the checklist. And I'll okay. So we finished the checklist. And I said, I saw a sign back there that said all jet aircraft must follow NADP 1 procedures. He's like, really? So we immediately looked into our company ops pages of our Jeppesen app. And that's where the company has all the procedures that they want you to follow for whatever particular aircraft you're in, or potentially just general procedures that they want you to follow. Las Vegas is one such airport where if you're departing in Las Vegas, it used to be all jet aircraft had to follow a very specific NADP1 procedure that the company had outlined, where your thrust reduction altitude was much higher than usual. It's actually double. I believe it was 3,000 feet over the field instead of the 1,500 or 1,000, depending on the procedure. So you had to follow this particular procedure. Now, in Las Vegas, that only applies on particular departures. Actually, I think just one departure that requires this special procedure. So we both kind of looked at each other and said, well, I don't see anything in the company flight ops pages indicating that there's anything other than the standard procedure, the normal noise abatement procedure, which is NADP2, which has a thrust reduction of 1,000 feet above field level. So once you reach 1,000 feet above field level, you go from your takeoff thrust setting to your climb thrust setting. And in our case, on the Airbus, it's either going to be set toga or set flex. Flex being the reduced thrust
Hmm.
takeoff, which is what we try to do almost every single time because it reduces the engine wear and puts less
Right.
stress on all the components associated with
Yeah.
it.
So yeah, real quick, let's make sure the listeners understand. When we depart airports, 9 times out of 10, we're not using 100% thrust from the engine. We're using a reduced thrust setting because number one, depending on our weight and runway lengths and depart obstacles and departure corridor of the airport, we don't need to have 100% thrust to get off the runway. We can use 80% or 90%, depending on what the performance calculations are. So what Aviator Tony's referring to is basically we'll use that reduced thrust to conserve fuel, wear and tear on the engine, and also noise. We just don't need to make all that noise on takeoff every single time.
Right.
So continue.
Yes, thank you. And so that's what the whole thrust reduction takeoff or the reduced thrust takeoff is. Now,
Yeah.
if you're dealing with noise abatement, meaning
Hmm.
there are residential communities around the airport, what you would think would be quieter is just to do a reduced thrust takeoff and then get the heck out of there, but that's not necessarily the case. What the studies have found over the years is that the more altitude the aircraft has closer into the airport, then when it reduces thrust, it's higher up and closer into the airport before it reduces that thrust, and therefore, as it's climbing out, it's quieter.
Yeah. Exactly.
And if there's an engineer that can explain this a little bit more technically, then by all means, send us an audio feedback.
Yeah.
But so I saw this on the taxi out, and the captain goes, "Well, I didn't see that sign, and I don't see anything here." So not that I don't believe you, but I mean, what's going on? So as we were taxiing, as we got closer to the last 500 feet of the taxiway before holding short of the departure or the hold short line,
Hmm.
the threshold, there was another sign. Same thing.
Yeah.
All jets must use NADP1 procedures. And the captain goes, "Oh, okay." So he immediately goes down into the what we call the FMGC, or the display panel for the
Hmm.
flight management system, and he immediately goes into the performance page and changes it from thrust reduction and acceleration altitude to 1,500 feet instead of 1,000 feet above field level.
Hmm.
And I was like, "Whoa, what? How did you know to do that?" I mean, because I know Vegas says, it's 3,000 feet. And he goes,
Right.
"Oh, well, let's take off." And then, he goes, "We're not going to hurt anything by doing this. Let's just take off and we'll look for it where it says in the manuals." And most of that
Cool.
flight, we were looking for it, and we couldn't find it.
Oh,
Um,
really?
but we finally did. And where we found it is in a place that most professional pilots, even to this day, have a hard time finding anything in there. Because in the old days, when we had kit bags with paper manuals, we usually had 3 fat binders. All right, the brown
Right.
Jeppesen binders, right? 2 of them were our JEP charts, where we had all our approaches and arrivals and all that stuff.
Right.
Then the third binder was the airways manual. And this
Hmm.
had all the airport, what the signs mean at the airport, all the rules for departures and holdings, and I mean it's basically like how to fly, but just not for dummies. I mean this is a very
Right.
very technical, very compacted information into a pretty small space.
Yeah.
So we ended up finding it, and the way we found it was we went through a button on our EFB in the JEP app called Pubs, publications.
Hmm.
Okay. From there, we ended up clicking on the airway manual tab. We found the general tab, and we started scrolling through it. Now, the pain in the arse with this is that there is no search feature in the Jeppesen app
Right.
that we found, at least.
Would be nice, but no.
Would be nice. So, because we knew we were going to talk about this today, last night, I decided to find that page. ladies and gentlemen. That's on page 1094, where it starts talking about noise abatement procedures. It's document 8168. And on a little bit further down, on page 1102, it talks about NADP 1 or A and NADP 2 or B. So let's talk about it.
Okay.
Page 1102 is entitled Flight Procedures for Noise Abatement, and it talks about Procedure A and B.
Mm-hmm.
So Procedure A talks about when you take off, from takeoff to 450 meters, in other words, 1,500 feet above aerodrome elevation. That's when you would use takeoff power and takeoff flaps. You would climb at V2 plus 20 to 40 kilometers per hour, which is V2 plus 10 knots to V2 plus 20 knots, or as limited by the body angle. At 450 meters or 1,500 feet, then you would do a reduced thrust to not less than climb power thrust. And you would climb out at V2 plus 10 to 20 knots. Then at 3,000 feet, you would accelerate smoothly to your en route climb speed with flap retraction on schedule. And they even have a beautiful little graph here. So this is not what we normally do.
No.
NADPA, or NADP1, depending on your company's definition of it, is a procedure that is non-standard. And it is for noise abatement. And when you look at the graph, you can see what you're doing is you're climbing almost like VX and VY in general aviation. You're climbing out basically at like VX, right? So you're getting altitude as fast as possible with a lower ground speed, and therefore you're getting higher, less distance away from the airport. That way, when you finally get to flap retraction speed, you're not as far away from the airport.
And you're higher.
And you're higher, right? So you're not making as much noise down low.
Right.
NADPB procedures, or NADP2, depending on your company, is also on that page, and it explains that this is the normal noise abatement procedure, and it would be takeoff thrust to 1,000 feet above aerodrome elevation and takeoff flaps and whatnot and the climb and the V speeds. So it kind of talks about it. It also says that for high bypass ratio engines, reduce to normal climb thrust after 1,000 feet.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that Captain Ash looked at the sign and within 1 second was like, oh, let me just change that on here. Now, this could change depending on the company's particular procedure for that particular airport and that particular aircraft. It could be from 1,000 feet to 3,000 feet for normal, and it could be 1,500 feet to 3,500 feet for, or 1,500 feet to 3,000 feet for the NADP A.
Right.
Now that you've heard all this technical jargon, and we're probably got crickets going on here for most of our listeners, why does this matter? Well, we've been talking about noise and noisy walkarounds and noisy cockpits and how, loud noises and the volume inside airports is very fatiguing and all these things, and wear ear protection. And we were kind of on a roll with this, and we're still moving strong, but we thought we'd talk about the noise abatement procedures a little bit as well. Hopefully all of you have gotten at least some kind of knowledge out of it.
Yeah. And also, if you want to be friendly neighbors to your airport neighbors, you know what I mean? If you're flying in and out of these airports, one of the biggest problems with airports and communities is noise. A lot of communities that live around airports really, really object to, the aircraft flying over their houses and stuff just because of the noise. If we can reduce the noise, we can become better or more friendlier in their eyes, and hopefully not generate so many noise complaints. So these procedures are all implemented at noise sensitive area airports so that we can become better neighbors and friendlier operators at these airports. John Wayne's Orange County Airport is another popular noise abatement area where we have to use those exact procedures as you talked about to you know leave the runway, get as high and as fast as we can, and then we'll have our thrust reduction. And a lot of passengers that have never experienced that before, it's startling to them because they think that the engines just quit because of the amount of thrust reduction, especially on our airplane. I mean, it's very, very um, aggressive as far as the power and the rotation, the deck angle. And then once we get to our 3,000 feet, we have that thrust reduction, and that's when we start retracting the flaps. So the engines come back, the noise, the decibel levels go way down, and then you almost have that sinking feeling or like falling out of the sky feeling because of the deck angle changing, as well as the flaps. Flaps retracting, so everything, you're going from an extreme angle and the climb and the acceleration with the ascent, and then pretty much leveling off. So you have that feeling, and then the flaps retracting, and there's a sensation that's always associated with the flaps retracting, and then the power reduction. It's quite aggressive, and it's not normal. And so sometimes uh, your captain will make that PA to the passengers, letting them know, hey, this is what's going to happen. It's not normal, but it's something that we're doing for the procedure, and it's where everything's going to be just fine.
Yeah. And, I remember hearing about it, and maybe you can clear it up a little bit. Is it true that the 737 has a specific takeoff thrust rating for Orange County?
That's right. It's a thrust rating that we only use for Orange County, and it's we call it a 27K bump. So normally our normal departures use anywhere from 22, 24, or 26K, or 26,000, 24,000, or 22,000 pounds of thrust per engine for the departure. And then, like we talked about a little bit earlier in the episode, where we use a little bit more reduced thrust from those values, depending on the performance, because John Wayne Orange County Airport is such a noise sensitive area, and the runway is extremely short. We use the maximum thrust available from the engine. So we use this thrust setting that is designed specifically for this situation, and it's 27,000 pounds of thrust, and it's the maximum thrust that these CF 50, what is it, CF 56-7 engines can produce. Um, and it's awesome. It's really cool. And we use our maximum flap setting for takeoff, which is flaps 25. That is, it's the plane just jumps off the runway. I mean, you're accelerating through 120, 130 knots, and you can feel it in the controls. It is light, and you're pretty much going to rotate at airspeed anyway. But when you rotate and you set the deck angle for the climb out, you're right at or just above 20 degrees deck attitude
Wow.
on the climb out. And this thing is it's just
Oh,
accelerating. It just wants to go. It's so much fun. And then at like we talked about at 3,000 feet, that's where the thrust reduction comes in, and you watch the thrust levers because 737, the thrust levers move as opposed to the Airbus. Actually, I think you guys, obviously, now that I'm learning, you have to move it back to whatever MCT or whatever it is,
yeah, just
climb
one
or
click or two clicks.
one click, yeah, whatever detent you
Climb.
have.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the 737, it's the auto throttles actually move automatically, and you watch them come back from, the firewall right up to the the maximum forward position to, yeah, it's about three-quarters of the way back. Because you realize, wow, that's a lot of thrust reduction there. And everything gets quiet, and you feel that sensation. Everything's going forward, and like you're almost sinking out of the sky. And then we start retracting the flaps, and the plane's accelerating, and it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun for us. But
Well, there's a secret that, and I have not experienced this yet, but the Airbus, the 321 and some other models as well, a select few models of the Airbus that we have out on the line at Legacy have something called thrust bump. So there's some
that's
guarded.
probably the CF 56 motors,
I
maybe.
believe that they
That's the
are.
same terminology that we have.
Yeah. So there's some buttons on the thrust levers, and they're guarded, and you're only allowed to use them when directed by the performance numbers and your dispatcher. You're
Sweet.
not allowed to use them any other time.
Right.
Every time you use thrust bump, it does reduce, I think, the life of the engine, and they have to do checks sooner. So you have a limited number of thrust bumps per life of that engine.
Yeah.
So when you're in need for this extra performance, after both engines start, that's very important, you would press one of the thrust bump buttons on the thrust levers and you would get this extra power. But then that's one hash mark on that engine, your
Yeah.
number. Um, I've not had the opportunity to do that yet. I've learned about it through training. You're going to learn about it yourself. So the Airbus does have something similar.
Yeah.
I don't know this very detailed specifics as you do. I
Right.
was while you were talking about that story about Santa Ana, I was looking through our company ops pages, and I did find exactly what you're saying for the 737 NG takeoff on runway 2 left or 20 right. And it
Hmm.
talks about the 27K and how to do it and how to enter it. And that's really interesting, really cool.
Yeah.
And have you had a chance to actually do that takeoff?
Yeah, we did it. I'd have to look back at my schedule, but yeah, we had to do that a couple weeks ago, and yeah, and it was my leg, and we were the check airmen also, so that made it all that much more fun because this is one of the profiles we train in the schoolhouse, which is the landing and departure out of Orange County. Because of the specific performance requirements. They just want to make sure we're getting it right every time,
Yeah.
which is something we have to do every time anyway. but but because this is such a rarity and in the essence of setting up the FMC and the box and everything like that and the flap settings, they wanted to make sure we get it right. So just doing it with a check airman was all that much more. Not I wouldn't say reassuring, but just fun because you do it with them in the schoolhouse and in the simulator, but now we're out here on the line and it's like, hey, we've done this many times before in the simulator. Let's do it in real life. And I've done it 3 or 4 times before this year with other pilots, but just being with a check airman was that much more fun. Get to
Yeah.
talk about it a lot more and everything like that. But that actually totally irrelevant to the conversation, but it happened to happen. It happened. You listen to me. It happened to happen.
Happy,
And
happy, happy, happy.
happy happen. It happened with that check airman going into Orange County, where because of the fuel prices we've experienced lately, we had a lot of ferry fuel
Wow.
going into Orange County. Right. So when we landed, we had I think 11,000 pounds of ferry fuel on the plane, and we experienced cold soaked fuel frost.
Mm.
So when we landed, the whole underside and the whole um, top of the wing was frosted. I mean, it's like 80 degrees outside, and the wing is just covered in frost. And it was outside of our parameters for being able to depart without having to get de-iced. So luckily, I think we had about an hour and a half, um, sit time over there, and they came in and they refueled the airplane early, and of course that warmer fuel getting into the wings and in conjunction with the sun melted all of the frost off the wing. But if we would have had a normal turn, 45 minutes to an hour, it would have been cutting it close. We
Yeah.
probably would have had to get de-iced out there. So
That's interesting. How that's How did you notice that the top of the wing had frost? Because we land very often where we
Yeah.
have this scenario, and the bottom of the wing has frost between the engine nacelle and the wing root, and it's
Yes.
acceptable to have up to one eighth of an inch of frost on the bottom side of the wing. For this scenario, even though
Yes.
it's 80 degrees outside, you'll get
Right.
that. How did you know the top of the wing had frost?
Well, so in our manuals, they talk about that cold soak fuel frost, and in the manual it says that if you're doing the walk around and you notice frost in this particular situation outside of a certain dips dipstick. I don't forget the technical
Yeah.
term for it, but it's a stick that is in the tank for measuring the fuel quantity in a particular tank. If the normal means is not available, if there's frost outside of that stick, then there's a good possibility that frost will be on top of the wing.
Ah,
And then on the 737, I haven't learned this about the Airbus yet, but on the 737, there's actually some markings on the top side of the wing that is for the cold soak fuel frost. If the frost extends outside of those markings, then it is beyond the limitation of what's acceptable for frost on top of the wing for a
ah,
cold soak fuel frost. So
ah.
we're allowed to have cold soak fuel frost for takeoff as long as that frost is inside of that box. But on a cold winter day, if you have frost anywhere,
Yeah,
even inside that box, you have to get
yeah.
de-iced.
There,
So
yeah.
one of those weird
That's interesting. I didn't know
things.
that about the 7.3. That's and so here's just you said that there are markings on the wing, and people
Mhm.
often don't realize everything, every marking, every sticker, every
Everything.
placard, it has a reason. And if you're ever in the as a passenger walking to the back of the aircraft, I know Airbus has this. I don't know if the Boeing has this as well. Somewhere around the middle of the aircraft, there's a red triangle over one of the passenger windows. That red triangle is the window that has the best view for the top of the wing to check the top of the wing for whatever reason, be it frost,
Huh.
snow, de-icing,
Hmm.
fuel caps, whatever.
Yeah.
So yeah, I know the Embraer had that as well. It had a marking over one of the wings.
Yeah.
That was the window that you would look outside. So
Yeah.
often back at Sandpiper, when we were de-iced and we were reaching our holdover
Hold
time,
over time.
but it stopped precipitating, and sometimes or the captain would say, "All right, go to the back and check," and I would walk right
Take a
to that
look.
window, and the passengers would look at me like, "Why is the pilot out of the cockpit? Get back in your hole." And I'd
Why
say,
is he
"Sir,
looking at the wings?
can you open up your window shade, please? I need to look outside." And I'd look right out, and I could have the best angle, best view to look
Yeah.
outside the window. So yeah, if you're a
Yep.
passenger in the back of the plane, you see the little triangle in your row, that's the best view.
That's what that
Top
is.
of the plane.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, I don't know if that's in a 737. There may be, but that's something that's you use very little. So, but now that we talked about it, I'm going to see if there is.
See, there it is. Planting the
Yep.
seed. Make bed.
And now that you talked about it, when I go to training, I'm going to know exactly what that is. I'll
Yep.
be the smart geek in the classroom.
Okay. So here's a way to win a beer or a dinner or whatever. So you might be flying when you're on IOE or maybe after, and they'll see that you're new on the aircraft, and you'll have a captain ask you, "Bet you a beer you don't know how many times the Airbus logo appears on our flight deck," and you'll say, "Yes, I do,"
What?
because it appears
How
six
many?
times.
6 times?
Yep, every rheostat knob has a
Uh-huh.
solar logo. That's the Airbus logo.
Ah,
Yeah.
6.
Six.
All right.
So there's 6 rheostats in the cockpit of an A320.
So if he goes, I bet you, I'm going to say, well, what's the bet? Give me something
Yeah,
substantial.
big. I'm like, look around like, oh, wow, I don't know the answer to this.